All right, let's get into post-war politics and talking about Harry Truman. After taking over for FDR, Truman matured into a decisive leader whose basic honesty and humble style appealed to the everyday average citizens. One of the phrases that he frequently used, he actually had a placard on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." And basically meaning he is the final say. But he made decisions. He did attempt to continue New Deal policies. A lot of the things that FDR was trying to preach as he was leaving office or as he was passing away. And one of them was the Employment Act of 1946. Truman's was to enact a series of progressive measures, including national health insurance and increased minimum wage. I think what's interesting is a lot of Americans believe that this was the first time in the last 10, 15 years under Obamacare and that type of thing that we tried to get national health care. This is something that's been going on for a long time. The increased minimum wage has been going on for a long time as well, but national health care insurance has been something that's been going on for a while. A watered-down version of this eventually got passed, and it also helped create the Council of Economic Advisors to counsel both the President and Congress on national economic welfare. The Council of Economic Advisors would still be around today, and it would be something that would have affected President Trump and Congress in making decisions about the economy during this pandemic that we're going through currently. Truman wanted Congress to continue a lot of wartime price, wage, and controls to keep inflation in check. The problem is Congress disagreed. An inflation rate of 25% during the first year and a half of peace. See, he kind of saw this coming, that all of a sudden prices would jump and wages would change and shift all over the place. So he wanted to kind of slow that down. And Congress didn't really want to work with him, mainly because they were Republican Congress. And you always have that gridlock where you have a Democratic president and a Republican Congress. Workers and unions wanted wages to catch up from the wartime economy. Remember, a lot of these people never got raises. They never got an increase in pay. And so a lot of these people wanted to make their voice heard. And they did so by going on strike. Over 4.5 million workers went on strike in 1946. Strikes by railroad workers, mine workers were industries that were heavily affected. However, Truman took a tough approach and had troops take over working in the mines until workers broke their strike. This is what we mean by the buck stops here. And he did that by saying, you guys can go on strike, but I'm going to get National Guard, I'm going to get Army individuals that are going to work these industries, and they'll get paid and you won't get paid. And eventually you'll go back to work. Why? Because these guys are getting 3 meals a day, they're having housing, this is part of their job, so get back to work. The Civil Rights, Truman created the Committee on Civil Rights in 1946. He also strengthened the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. Most importantly, in 1948, he ordered the end of racial discrimination through the federal government and the armed forces. He urged Congress to create a Fair Employment Practices Commission, something that FDR passed while he was in office, which would prevent employers from discrimination in hiring. Harry Truman was one of the first presidents of the modern age to really try to get the discrimination to end and segregation to end in a lot of different avenues, particularly military and particularly workplace. Letter B, Republican control. Unhappy with inflation and strikes, voters pushed the Republicans into control of Congress at the midterm elections. And as we've stated throughout this year, that at midterm elections you kind of get a good viewpoint of what a president's doing. If the president isn't doing a very good job, a lot of times at midterm elections, his party will lose out. The Republican Congress were successful in amending the Constitution and rolling back some of the New Deal gains for labor. By amending the Constitution, we mean number 3, the 22nd Amendment. To prevent another president from serving 4 times, they passed this amendment to limit the presidential terms, which said that you could serve a maximum of 10 years. Basically, this is called the FDR bill. The Taft-Hartley Act was a pro-business bill. Truman vetoed this measure, but Congress overrode it. The Republican Congress was trying to check the growing power of unions. And unions tried to repeal this for years. This is probably one of the first stages in when you think about unions, you think about people voting Democratic, especially in our area of Flint. A lot of times, if you are a union worker, we would consider you a blue collar worker, but you would also vote blue for the Democrats, and this is probably where it first began. The unions, again, tried to repeal this, but here's what the Taft-Hartley Act said. It outlawed the closed shop, meaning you had to join a union before hiring into the actual work, meaning if you wanted to work for GM, you had to join the union first. It also permitted states to pass right-to-work laws, meaning a contract requiring workers to join a union after being hired. And so they allowed them to do that part, but you couldn't have them have to join the union before hiring him. It outlawed secondary boycotts. This is kind of an interesting one. It would be like this if Jonah was a mine worker and was being mistreated and he and his individuals wanted to go on strike, then Walker, who would be a iron worker, he would say, I'm going to go on strike for the people who are working in the mines. It's called the sympathy strike, also known as a secondary strike. And so they outlawed that. It also gave the president the power to invoke an 80-day cooling off period before a strike endangered the national safety, uh, before endangering national safety. What we mean by that is this, is that the president could literally tell people, you have to continue to work for the next 80 days, and there's going to be no discussion, there's going to be a cooling off period, everybody goes to work, everybody gets paid, the work goes on, just so we kind of calm ourselves down, we make sure that we're not freaking out. And so anyway, that was part of the cooling off period that we were going to have. And again, it was kind of interesting because Truman really vetoed this. You might be like, this seems like pretty reasonable. Well, it might seem reasonable because you guys are possibly Republicans. But back then, Truman vetoed this measure because he didn't feel like it was really helping the workers. Again, as we said before, it was a pro business bill. The election of 1948, Truman's popularity was at a low point as the 1948 campaign for the presidency began. You might be like, this dude just ended World War II. What's going on? Well, we get back to some normalcy and the economy starts kind of, slowing down just a little bit. And people aren't as tied to Harry Truman. They were really, truly tied to FDR. We told you that people had pictures of him in their house. It wasn't the same for Truman. He was a little bit more of a gruff personality as well. Many Democrats abandoned Truman to create their own parties. The Progressive Party was run by Henry Wallace. Now, don't think progressives as the 1920s. This is a different type of progressive party. And then you also had the Southern Democrats, which are also called Dixiecrats, which were run by Strom Thurmond. If that name looks familiar, he's the guy that did that filibuster for over 24 hours. The Dixiecrats were exclusively running against Truman's civil rights policies, meaning the Dixiecrats didn't want Harry Truman to continue to have policies that would end segregation. The Dixiecrats were for segregation. The Republicans chose Thomas Dewey, who looked like he was a shoo-in to win. He ran a very conservative and unexciting campaign, but basically was the opposite of Truman. Truman hit the nation via railroad. He attacked Congress with his famous give 'em hell speeches where he would basically rail on Congress for not passing a lot of his stuff and not being very focused on helping the common person. The result, Truman baffled the experts by winning the popular vote by 2 million votes and winning the Electoral College 303 to 189. He reunited many of the Roosevelt states, minus a couple of the Deep South states that went to Thurmond. Now, you might be like, what do you mean he baffled the experts? This is that really, really famous picture of Truman holding up a newspaper from the Chicago Tribune that says Dewey defeats Truman. They were so confident they started printing out newspapers before the results were actually stated, and sure enough, they were wrong. You next have the Fair Deal. Truman launches an ambitious program to enact national health care insurance, federal aid to education, civil rights legislation, funds for public housing, higher wages, and a new farm program. Most of these reforms were blocked by Congress, but the minimum wage was increased from 40 cents to 75 cents. Yes, you are reading that correctly. Now, you might be like, what can I have to reference what this would be like? Well, think of it like this. Today, you can get a McChicken sandwich for $1, and minimum wage, I think, is at $9.75 or something like that. Well, back then, 75 cents an hour, and a cheeseburger was 19 cents. So you can kind of do a little bit of the math and the percentages there. So standard of living is going up, but it's just not that great yet. But people were still living a pretty good lifestyle, believe it or not. And more workers would be covered under Social Security, meaning they would extend the Social Security program to more people, not just the elderly. The programs were defeated for two reasons: Truman's political conflicts with Congress. He could just never really get along with them. But the big thing that really changed the viewpoint of the Fair Deal was the pressing foreign policy concerns with the Cold War. People were really unsure what was going to take place with Russia, and so their focus wasn't necessarily on federal aid to education and healthcare insurance, civil rights legislation, and funds for public housing and farming. They were focused on national defense. They were focused on spies coming into our country. They were focused on making sure that communism did not spread. Though a lot of these policies were not passed, critics praise him for at least maintaining the New Deal reforms and bringing many issues to light. He's going to kind of kick things off for the presidents in the 1950s and specifically the 1960s, as he's going to address some of these issues prior to them. And they're going to kind of, I don't want to say be inspired, but they're at least going to use his arguments and use his platform in order to get votes all over the country. And so that would what we would call a fair deal. He would frequently say, I'm trying to give a fair deal to all people. All right, we're going to stop here. We're going to get into the Cold War tomorrow. Hope you have a good day. Don't forget about your worksheets. Please turn those in.